So welcome to Edinburgh. My name's Sue MacDonald and I'm the chair for the day. This is a bit weird for me because I haven't done the face-to-face for quite a while now because I've been behind, like everybody, we've been Zooming everywhere. So this is quite interesting. Okay, so I think at this point I'm going to move to our first speaker.
I'm not going to do a kind of traditional PowerPoint presentation because it's the end of the day, you're all thinking about how you're getting home, what you're having for your tea, you know, and if I stand up here and waffle about me for the next 20 minutes, that will just bore the boobs off you, and that won't be a whole lot of fun. So what I want to do is actually speak about what innovation is. Now, a lot of people think innovation in midwifery is about what we're doing in practice and how we can make things different. I want to kind of challenge that a bit and let you go away with the idea of you as a personal innovator, because there is a process to these things. So I'll start with just a little about me and my background, but not too much because that's not terribly interesting to you. And then we'll go through some ideas around innovation and how it can make a difference just to you as an individual, as opposed to thinking that you have to go out there and reinvent the wheel or discover penicillin. You don't. You know, big things start with small changes, and that's really what I'm going to talk about. So I went into midwifery 26 years ago. I actually trained down south and worked down there for quite a few years. Really enjoyed working in midwifery, doing all sorts of different roles. I worked in reproductive sexual health family planning clinics as well for a while. And then my husband and I, we moved back up to Scotland with our 3 boys. And when I first moved up, I decided that I quite liked the job that I had in Essex at the time. So I managed to convince them to allow me to work 4 on, 6 off, because my husband worked 6 on, 4 off. So I used to fly down, stay in the nurse's home, do my shifts, come back, and theirs over the month worked out full time. So I did that for a few years until my youngest started school, and then it didn't really work. And I thought, what do I need to do now? How can I stay in practice in a way that I feel is sustainable for us? So I set up an independent practice. I worked on the West Coast and Central Belt, and that was all great. Really enjoyed doing it. Looked after people really from Dumfries up to Largs and out to the far side of Glasgow. Some years did that for about 8 or 9 years, and some years I might have 10 people, other years I might have 20 people, and it really just depended. During that time, I started Mama Conference, and that'll be its 10th year. It's been running 12 years, but with 2 years off, obviously. And that's in April every year, and it's a 2-day event. And I started that really because somebody said to me, why do we never get lots of the kind of big, well-known speakers up in Scotland? We're always having to travel down to England. And at that time, that was true. There wasn't an awful lot on in Scotland. And I thought, well, has anybody asked them? Is that actually the issue? And it turned out nobody had. So that first one, we had 100 people come along. I thought if we get 60, it'll all be good. We had 100 people come along and we're sold out. And now, the last one in 2019, we had 500 people on each day. It's a 2-day thing, and around 350 at a ceremony at night. I don't speak at the conference because that's not what I'm there to do, and there's people much more interesting than me that people want to go and hear. So that's a big thing. During that time, I invented a product called the Cub. And it's basically an inflatable birth stool. It's now sold in 90 countries around the world, 90 plus actually. Biggest markets, USA and China. I employ 8 people in that business to run that for me. I travel quite a lot when I'm able to. So that's my life right now. So I'm running a business, I'm selling things that I invented, and that's just what I do right now. So I'm still a midwife, and that's absolutely really important to me. But what I've done is I've created ways of working and finding ways to work that suit me in my life and the aspirations that I have as an individual. But when we talk about innovation, a lot of people think it's one of those buzzwords that you hear, innovation, oh, it's all going to be great. And actually, it's not always great. Sometimes it's really bad. Now, I'm sure a lot of people can think of innovations that have been brought in that really aren't that great, really don't do what they're meant to do, or were invented with the idea of creating something that would improve outcomes. So what's the point of innovation? Well, the point is that you change things, you improve things. But if whatever you come up with doesn't do that, is it actually an innovation, or is it just a big disaster? Now, an example of that would be in the 70s, somebody actually patented a device where the pregnant woman would be strapped into this device and spun by centrifugal force with a net between her legs, and the baby would fire out into this thing. Now, that somebody spent weeks, days, months, hours coming up with that rubbish, and then actually spent the money to patent it. Now, that is innovation. Was it good innovation? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I was also asked about 5 years ago I do a lot of product design and product innovation stuff now, and I'm quite often asked to give my input into products that are usually coming out of university spin-off ideas. And it was a university in California, and they had spent $800,000 developing this thing, and their first prototype that they were taking around exhibitions cost over $100,000. And the problem they had identified, this doctor had identified, was that women weren't upright enough. So instead of thinking, well, why are they not? What's up with their legs? What's going on there? They decided the problem is women aren't upright, so we need to build something that will help them be. So this thing was like a patient hoist, but a really tall one. And it had like a kind of suspended toilet seat thing and a harness. And basically this poor pregnant woman was sat on this toilet seat, strapped in. They pressed a button and it hoisted her up in the air with her bum to dangle over a bed. And that was their solution for helping women be more upright and mobile. Now, during that call, it was a Zoom call, many times I dropped my pen on the floor, unfortunately, because I was under the desk like that, trying not to laugh at how ludicrous it was. But more than ludicrous, what a waste of money. What a waste of money and time. Unfortunately, there's a lot of innovations like that. There isn't a huge amount of innovation, I think, in maternity care. There are some innovations that have come in recently that are, regardless of how you see it, things like continuity of care. Now, I actually think continuity of care is a great thing and it can work in certain circumstances, but I don't think it was the solution to what the problem really is, because the problem is actually staffing. That's the real problem. If we had enough staff, if we had enough midwives, if the services were running as they should and women could get the care that they actually need, we wouldn't be, continuity would be just a really great thing to add to it, but it's not the solution. So that brings me back to, what is the process of innovation then? How do we actually do that? And there is a process. And the reason most innovations actually fail is because they fail to identify the root problem. The root problem is what guides the steps forward. So when you have to think about what is the problem as an individual, so if you think about something in your life, just in your own personal life, that you need to change, you need it to work better, you need a better outcome, you need to understand it differently, you have to make a change. First, you have to know what the problem really is. Is the problem really you don't have enough time, or is the problem you're not managing your time? Is the problem you're not getting the support from people around you to help manage your time? What is the problem? And then you have to think about, well, why is that a problem to me? What does it mean to my life if I let this continue? And then you have to think, well, what could I do to change that? How can I improve that? And then you have to think, well, what am I going to need? Do I need help? Do I need somebody to come and pick the kids up? Do I need himself or herself, whoever your significant other is, indoors to actually put the hoover around instead of me coming home and the house being a tornado has hit it? You know, so you have to identify what you need to make that change. And once you have done that, you move on to a process of thinking. Now, I do something with businesses that I mentor called 4 weeks to creative clarity. And what you do is you give yourself 4 weeks. And on 5 days a week, you write down a task. Week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. And that task might be as simple as phone so-and-so, email so-and-so, tiny, 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 tiny little steps. Because in 4 weeks, if you do one little thing 5 days a week, by the end of the month, you've done 20 things towards changing what you want to change. And when you break it down to these tiny, tiny tasks, you get into the small changes have the biggest result. It's very important that you actually do that. So the other thing we can think about in terms of midwifery, what is another innovation that came in that's widely adopted that we know doesn't actually massively increase outcomes or help people or actually do what it was initially promoted to do? Anybody got any ideas? CTG. Simple one, common one, brought in about 40 odd years ago, was meant to be used only for specific people under specific circumstances, and before we knew it, everybody that even blinked, a minute past they were pregnant, it was, oh, you'll need a CTG. And millions and millions and millions and millions of pounds were thrown at getting CTGs. And even now, updating them, wireless and all fancy and all sorts of singing and dancing things. But the reality is, the research showed that it doesn't really improve outcomes for women. So what are we spending the money on? Does it only help a small group of people? Undoubtedly it does. Does it actually lead to more caesarean sections than there should be? Undoubtedly it does. So innovation can have a double-edged side to it. Don't always believe it's good. When you want to progress some kind of idea, there is something that I use when I'm mentoring called Hoshin planning. Hoshin planning is actually a step-by-step process that you can go through to progress an idea. And that was developed by the Japanese after Hiroshima, when they needed to rebuild whole cities. And they knew it was a massive task, so they created task groups to break down each element. And it's massively successful. That's why Japanese innovation is so good and so fast and changes so quickly, because they do a process of it. So you as an innovator, what I would suggest you do, now I have on my desk, I have at work lots of these little notebooks, right? And they're all my potentially great ideas. And some of them are actually a lot of rubbish, a lot of nonsense, but I use it as an exercise. And if it's not been your practice to do so before, and you think, I couldn't come up with an idea, because somebody will laugh at me. Somebody will say, who does she think she is? Somebody will say, why bother, it won't work. Even though you've sat and you've thought about it, they will have an opinion on it. One of the things for me, actually writing down my potentially great ideas, does is it exercises my confidence. Because nobody's going to laugh at me. Nobody's going to see these things, and 99 out of 100 times, they're just nonsense. they're just rubbish. I've had ones before that have been, like I had an idea for printed condoms, and I was going to call them jock socks. And they were Scottish themed, of course. And I was going to sell them to stag do's. Now, I actually just thought that process through, thought, where can you get them? Can you get them printed? Do they still work? Do they prevent pregnancy? Does the dye come off? You know? And actually, all I was doing was exercising my brain in a safe way. And it doesn't mean anything. I don't know whether MD, if you want to make jock socks, have it, yours. Yeah, I will really, really support you in that one. So it's about really finding your own voice about these innovations, and innovation not as something for your employer, not for your university, not for anybody else, but for you as an individual. What you can innovate in your life, and start with that innovation and exercise your innovation muscle, because it is a use it or lose it situation. Once you've started actually practicing innovation, it becomes really easy and it becomes second nature. I take myself off for a holiday for a week every year on my own, and that time is my kind of decompression time. Now in September I went to Crete, and while I was there lying about, I redesigned in my head the whole hotel. I worked out new ways of the staff working, how the food could be served, because that's how I exercise my brain. And it's almost therapeutic. It is very therapeutic to figure out problems. Nobody's ever going to hear that. It's never going to be acted on, but it's actually just a practice that you need to get into if you're interested in innovation. One of the things to look at with innovation is if you come up with a good idea that actually is during your employment time, that innovation, the intellectual property around it might be owned by your employer. So make sure if you do, you always keep things a very tight diary time of when and where you came up with this idea. So I wonder if anybody has ever heard of somebody called Valerie Hunter-Gordon. Anybody ever heard of her? She was the lady in 1947. She actually invented disposable nappies, the biggest selling product in the world. And she was from Bewley, outside Inverness. Why did she invent disposable nappies? Because she had 6 children under 8. And she said she wished every day she could throw every dirty nappy in the bin. She hated washing them. So she sat and she made basically a disposable nappy with a throwaway liner in it. Woman in Inverness. So her innovation came from her life. And that's why I want you to think about innovation starts with you. It's not something you do for other people in a remote place. It starts with you inside. Another person is a lady called Cecilia Payne. Has anybody ever heard of her? Cecilia Payne actually discovered what planets and stars in the universe are made from. Now, she was born in 1900 down in England someplace, and her father died when she was young, and her mother was raising 4 children, and she had older brothers, and her mother couldn't afford to send her to university because it had to be paid for then. By families. There was no support for that. However, she really wanted to go, so she got a scholarship and she went, and she got her degree in astrophysics, I think it was. But she wasn't awarded a degree because Cambridge didn't give women degrees before 1948. So she knew if she stayed in the UK, she wouldn't be able to progress. So she took a lab assistant's job in Harvard in the USA. She was the first woman in the late, and she was employed as a lab technician. She discovered hydrogen. She discovered that she took 3 million photos of planets to talk about variable stars, and she found out what the sun was made of. But the person that gets credit for find out what the son was made of was actually a guy that was her boss in the lab, that told her, don't publish that, it's not any use. 4 years later, he did, and of course won a great big prize for doing so. She was employed as a lab assistant right up until the 50s. However, after that, she threatened to leave them. And they very quickly encouraged her she was the first woman to ever be awarded a PhD for astrology. So she's an incredibly innovative person, and she innovated because her life wasn't working out the way she wanted. She got a scholarship. She worked out the problem was no money. She needed somebody to fund her. She got basically her degree, but worked out she was never going to be appreciated for what she was interested in. So she took herself abroad. She changed her circumstances after that. And she eventually lived a very long, very illustrious life that actually only died in 2000 and something. And what a phenomenal person to actually find her way through that. There was another lady, Rosalind Franklin, and she also discovered lots of chemical processes. It was a woman that innovated finding out how, in 71, a Japanese woman that discovered isolated stem cells. There was this other lady, actually Rosalind Franklin was the person who discovered, I'm sure has heard of Watson and Crick and how they discovered the double helix of DNA. It wasn't actually them. Although in 1962 they did get the Nobel Peace Prize. They had a theory that's what it looked like. Rosalind Franklin was the one that took the pictures and discovered it. And she was never acknowledged. They used her picture to confirm their theory, and it was her that had actually discovered it. So I'm not making any apologies for talking about women in innovation, because women in innovation, there's only 17% of all patents filed in the UK mention a woman as part of the filing team. 12% of them name the woman as the lead innovator, and only 2% of all patents are granted to women only in the UK. 2%. And when you look back at our history of innovation, nappies, the stars, the sun, DNA, you know, why is some bozo with a machine that spins you around so your baby gets fired out into a net got a patent? You know, what is that all about? What is that all about? So I make no apologies for showing my bias towards women in innovation, because I think our voices have actually been dampened down quite a lot over the years. So it's been a bit of a kind of whistle-stop tour around this. Innovation in itself is something that you shouldn't ever be afraid of, but you should always question it, particularly if somebody has come up with it, because questioning is good. And sometimes people say to me, I'm very lucky, my business is very successful now. And people say to me, if you could do things differently, what would you do? What would you change? And what I say is nothing. I would change nothing. I needed every mistake. I needed every problem, because every one of them pushed me back to where I was meant to be. Every one of those problems were crucial, and some of them were pretty painful, and some of them were pretty expensive, and a lot of them kept me up at night. But I had to have them to move on. So most of you, I think, are students. And what I want to say to you is innovation and change, whether you use it in your role as a midwife, whether you use it as an individual, starts in you. Find yourself a wee book. Write rubbish. Nobody will see it, doesn't matter. But start exercising it, and you will find that little things as you go along will start to change, particularly in your practice, because I can honestly say midwifery is one of the few professions where innovation on an individual level can make a difference. Every woman you look after, you will innovate for. You'll change, you'll move things around the room, you will move in a different way, you'll speak different words. to innovate for her, every single time. So actually you have a head start over a lot of people, because that's what you're learning to do. You're learning to innovate on a personal level. And that's really all I've got to say about innovation in midwifery today. Is there anybody want to ask me any questions?
So this is a little bit different, but it's great to see you. For everybody who is watching from home and wondering why is she not wearing a mask, because I make lots of noise online about being COVID safe and wearing a mask. Just for everybody who's watching, just so you know, pretty much everybody else in the room is wearing a mask. I'm triple vaxxed, and I'll be putting my mask back on as soon as I'm done. So we're all super safe. So as you can see from the name of the presentation today, it is Midwifing the Midwives, Tools for Survival in the NHS, because I think this is a topic that we all really need to talk about and know about right now, considering that things in our working environment are so challenging. Now, you'll notice I also have a PowerPoint, which I hardly ever do. Anybody who's seen me talk online before knows that I usually just sit at my desk and kind of blather for 20 minutes. I did a poll on Instagram recently asking students and midwives whether they felt PowerPoint was useful or effective, and it was kind of like 50-50 down the line. So I thought, well, try and be professional today. I'll do it for Sue. I'll do it for you guys, and there are no learning outcomes, there are no goals, there's no test. It's just going to kind of go through roughly what I'm talking about today. So without any further ado, we will click on. Okay. So midwifery then and now. Well, I qualified in 2013, so it's just over 8 years since I qualified and was feeling very much like a lot of you in this room, absolutely terrified. Not much has changed. But when I first started my training in 2010, the whole thinking about challenges of the role was very, very different from what it is now. So we were actually told, sat down on my very first day of uni, and I remember it very clearly, and we were told there are no jobs. And you will have to get your handbags out. This was my lecturer's actual words. Get your handbags out and fight each other for the jobs because there are none. So, and she was right in a sense, apart from the handbags. At the time, there was a real atmosphere of kind of scarcity of jobs. And those who had recently qualified definitely confirmed that that was true. Substantive posts were thin on the ground. Even getting onto the staff bank was really, really difficult. And so we kind of had this mindset from the very start of just do whatever it takes to get a job. If somebody had said to me then, yeah, but like, how are you going to protect yourself as a midwife? How are you going to protect yourself on the job? I'd be like, well, protect myself from what? I just want a job. Like, I'll do anything. And that was very much the kind of belief that was instilled in us from the start. And I think not out of any sort of malice or wanting to wind us up, it was just because that actually was the best way our lecturers could think to prepare us for a really competitive workplace. Obviously, things now are different in terms of scarcity of jobs. It can be still quite difficult to get a job, but the reality now is more of unfilled vacancies and units seeking to recruit new midwives or midwives of any standing as quickly as they possibly can. So Sue mentioned the figure of being short of 3,500 midwives and said quite rightly that it feels like we need a lot more than that. I'm sure that must be the case. So it's a very different picture now from what it was when I started out, which, 8 years, not that long ago really in the grand scheme of things. But against that backdrop, we have to sort of reevaluate how we're behaving in our profession and, in fact, how we are protecting ourselves. The other thing that has changed is the complexity and the quantity of the workload. So when I qualified as a midwife, it's not as if it was easy. It's never been easy. And I work in a big unit, big busy unit, where we are lucky to care for people with all kinds of needs, clinical, emotional, psychological, social. But I feel like over the last 8 years, that's just amped up and up and up and up. Added to that, generally our population year on year their baseline of health is not as great as it was. The people we're caring for are generally bigger, sicker, in some cases older. So they really do have a lot more complex needs. And for every midwife, that adds a certain level of workload. I feel like also the quantity of the work has gone up. And I think if you look at the data, I think the birth rate has actually dropped slightly, I believe, but it doesn't feel like that. And I don't know if there are actually stats on this, but it feels like even if the birth rate is dropping, it seems like per woman or per person going through the system, they have more visits and more contacts with the system. Definitely as a triage midwife, well, I've worked all over the place, but predominantly in triage, it feels like 8 years ago, the average person would maybe come to triage maybe once or twice in their pregnancy, if that. Maybe reduced movements, maybe a bleed at some point, and then in labor, and that was it. Now, for whatever reason, it feels like people are in and out all the time. And I'm not going to trivialize that. I mean, more often than not, the reason for seeking help is definitely valid, but it feels like per person there's a lot more contact with the system. So that's ramped up the workload as well. The other thing that's changed, the third point, is something I don't even really need to tell you about, because the fact that I'm looking out at a sea of masks is, evidence enough that we are in a pandemic. We're still in it. We've lived through a disaster over the last 18 months, and we're still living through it. It is not over yet. And that, of course, comes with a huge clinical and emotional load. Clinically, we've been looking after women with COVID. Well, I certainly have. I'm sure many or all of you have as well. And also, we've had the emotional load of so many different things. First of all, obviously, we're human. We're just people before we're midwives, so we're worried about our own safety and the safety of our families and our loved ones. Will I get sick? Will I die? I didn't sign up to this when I became a midwife. Do I have to get the vaccine? I didn't sign up to that either. So we've got all these individual questions in our heads, which we bring to work every day. And then there's also the emotional load of the things we've had to witness in caring for very sick women over the last year, things we've had to do and rules we've had to enforce. So this is a big bugbear for me, and I feel like it doesn't really get discussed very much, the fact that we've had to reinforce visiting restrictions and sort of isolation of women from their partners that we know is for a good reason, but it's been quite traumatic and distressing to enforce those rules. So I didn't become a midwife to be an enforcer, and I'm sure none of you did either. So that's had a big emotional load as well. And we've also had to develop totally different ways of working, everything from wearing a mask, which is a huge disconnect and a big change, to new pathways. This is a red area, this is a green area, this is where you isolate women, this is how you put your PPE on. All these kinds of things are mind-boggling on top of the already really complex and difficult workload. So I'm tired just thinking about it. So a lot has changed in my 8 years, and probably even just in your last year of midwifery or being a student. So, we'll go back. Told you it was my first PowerPoint. So, has education changed in that time? Well, a lot of you can probably tell me better than I can, but I get a lot of feedback from student midwives on social media and things, and it sounds to me like, by and large, the curricula for degree courses is fairly unchanged, and I'm sure there are some tweaks and adjustments, and I applaud the people who are doing that. But what I'm hearing from you guys is that your curriculum reflects a period of midwifery that is now gone. So we learn promotion of maternal health, obviously. We learn everything from basic first aid and immediate life support to auscultation, palpation, suturing, CTG interpretation, care of the very ill woman, everything to keep this woman or person safe and well. Obviously, we learn how to promote the health of the fetus or the neonate, whether that's through interpreting auscultation or ultrasound scans or neonatal resuscitation or initial examinations or, all these different vast and various skills that we learn and you should learn as students, really important. But what I'm hearing from you guys is that the curriculum doesn't really reflect or incorporate much, if anything, to do with the health of the midwife. And it's kind of a cliche now, like, who hasn't seen a pretty meme on Instagram saying, you can't pour from an empty cup? Like, it's almost like sick of hearing it, but it's so true. You can't be there and protect and care for the people that you come to work to care for if you yourself are suffering and you're uncared for and you're supported. And it may be that the system that you work in or that you end up working in will not support you. Just going to be realistic. So we have to learn how to support and nurture ourselves. And maybe that's something that we should be learning at a very early stage. So what I'm getting here is that you guys are underprepared or unprepared, or at least a lot of you feel that way. And how do I know? Because you told me. So one of the kind of unexpected consequences of having written a book, Hard Pushed, in 2019, is that I've gotten to connect with lots and lots of midwives and student midwives on social media, on Instagram and Twitter, which is great. And you guys tell me all the time that what you're learning at uni doesn't actually, on many levels, match up with what you're then expected to do, either as a senior student or a newly qualified midwife. So I get DMs all the time, messages from you guys about stuff that you're going through on placement or in practice. And sometimes it's great and you've had a great day and you've had a really fantastic experience. But I feel like a lot of the times I don't hear about the great stuff, and a lot of the messages that you are sending me are actually quite distressing and quite worrying. That you feel unsupported, that you feel unprepared, that you're working in an environment that feels fundamentally unsafe, that you don't know how to escalate that, or even if you do escalate that, it's not met with the response you were hoping for. And on a personal level, sometimes when you communicate with me about your well-being, that is really worrying as well, because a lot of you are not okay. And that's not okay with me. Now, obviously, I can't fix that for everybody, but it worries me, and that's why I'm here today, because you've told me. So I think there are a couple of different tiers of skills that are needed in pre-registration courses that maybe are not being taught or not being taught to the extent or detail that they could be. So first of all, let's just look not at the kind of warm and fuzzy personal growth stuff, but at the actual black and white concrete skills that you need as midwives to protect your registration when the bad stuff hits the fan, because it will, and it does. So here is what I'm sensing may be missing. And again, I'm sure some of this is covered in some courses, and if that's your course, amazing, fantastic. But what I'm getting is that a lot of this is not what you're learning. So first of all, documentation. The old adage, if it's not written down, it didn't happen, is true. So your documentation is your registration. That is your record of what you've done, what has happened, actions you've taken, and how you've kept yourself and the birthing person or their baby safe. Now, one of the things that's changed over the last 8 years, and this does make me a little bit of a dinosaur, is that we've gone from handwritten notes to, where I work, electronic documentation, which is BadgerNet. Raise your hand if you're on BadgerNet. Yay! Or yay or boo, depending on how you feel about BadgerNet. And there are different systems as well across the UK that some of you are using. So, I mean, I could do a whole other 40 minutes on BadgerNet. I won't. You'll be glad to hear. But I have really mixed feelings about it, because in some cases, this electronic documentation is really helpful because it prompts you as the user to input certain information. But it takes away the skill of learning to think independently about what you're writing. So I think a really important skill as a midwife is to look at the situation in front of you, everything that is happening, and to already know how to organize in your mind what the situation is, what your impression is of that situation, what's happened already, what you're going to do, and then what you're going to do if that doesn't work. So you can call it an SBAR, situation, background, assessment, recommendation, or whatever you want to call it. But I think what students now aren't learning, because you're now digital natives who are learning on these electronic systems, is you're not learning how to spontaneously think through what you're going to write and how you're going to be sure that you write everything that supports your registration when somebody goes back and scrutinizes it. So that's really important, and I think everyone needs to learn that. Even if you're badgering for the rest of your life, I think it's important. So the next skill that I think is missing is how to escalate concerns safely and professionally. So a lot of you send me DMs saying, oh my God, today was so unsafe. There was one midwife or 18 patients, or, you know, I had a dodgy CTG and I tried to page the reg and nobody came. I mean, I'm just sort of making these up from real messages that I've received. And unfortunately, the reality, guys, is that you will be working in some circumstances that will be dangerous and will be unsafe. And I don't want to scare anybody, because on the whole, you will be able to give care that's safe and of a good standard and things will go well. But I'm here to tell you, as somebody who's out there and in amongst it, you will be working at times when it is not safe. And your responsibility as a midwife is to know how to escalate that and how to do it in a way that's professional and effective. So you feel free to message me and say, my shift was really unsafe, but I can't do anything about that, okay? It's ultimately, as qualified registered professionals, it's on you. So you need to know how to do things like, well, I'm the junior midwife on the ward, who do I tell? Well, you need to know how to escalate things to your senior charge midwife, your band 7. You need to know how to get in touch with the hospital coordinator and how to feel assertive enough to tell that person, A, that things are dangerous, B, why things are dangerous, and C, what you want done to rectify that situation. And if you don't get the response that you're looking for, you need to know how to take that higher, which is quite scary and daunting if you're fairly junior, but you need to know. And you need to know about DATEX, which is the application, you fill in a form when you've had a near miss or an adverse outcome. It's boring. You guys need to know how to do it, because that shows that you've acted on something that was unsafe. You also need to have an understanding of the whole system of clinical risk. So when you file a DATEX, or when something adverse happens or almost happens, that DATEX or that documentation will go to your unit's clinical risk team. And this is a team made up of midwives, mainly obstetricians, consultants, managers, and they will look at that written evidence to determine whether you've acted appropriately, maybe there are lessons to be learned. And it's almost like so scary to think of things going wrong that we just don't want to think about it. I mean, it gives me like the heebie-jeebies just thinking about it as well, because we never want to find ourselves having to write something for clinical risk. But guess what? It's inevitable. Even if you do everything right, you will be asked to write a statement or reflection on something that you did for, somebody that maybe went on to have something bad happen to them. So we have to understand these mechanisms, and we have to understand our role in them. It doesn't have to be scary. If you get an email and you see at the top, I would like you to write a statement for care of patient da-da-da, CHI da-da-da, you want to get to the point where you don't automatically have a sinking feeling, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job, it's all over, here it comes, which I have had that feeling many times. But you want to get to a point where you go, okay, I understand how this system works. I remember being taught about this, even though I've only been qualified for 3 weeks and I'm scared. I know now what I have to do, and I know how that information will be reviewed by the people in charge. Okay, so a lot of us don't even know how to write a statement. Now, when I was actually a student, I had to write a statement. There was a lady that I'd looked after. Long story short, she'd lost a piece of jewellery in amongst lots of acute things happening, and I had to write a statement because she thought I had stolen her jewellery. I don't know why. She identified me. There were lots of people involved, but she had said after the fact that student took my jewellery. So of course, there's me in floods of tears. Oh, I'm going to lose my job before I'm even qualified. It's all over. I'll never be a midwife. Did I steal? Is it in my uniform somewhere? Of course I didn't. But you start second guessing yourself, and the same thing happens when there's an adverse outcome. I thought I did everything right, but did I sign that CTG, or did I give that drug? I wrote down that I did, but did I really do it? And everybody's brain starts going through this whole scenario. So even as a student, I had to write a statement. I had no idea how. We had a designated supervisor for our group of students. I said, I don't know how to write a statement. I'm really scared. She wrote me back a sort of like vague one-line email, and I still didn't know how to write a statement. And I was terrified. Fortunately, it was all fine. It blew over. Obviously, I didn't steal the jewelry. It was okay. But I've had to write many statements in the intervening years, not always about something that I've actually contributed to, but even if you look after a woman at 12 weeks and she has a loss at 38 weeks, you will probably be asked to write a statement about your contribution to that episode of care. And only now do I know exactly what I need to write, in what order, what I should leave out, what I should not write. I've made all the mistakes, and done it wrong because I didn't know and I wasn't taught, and I wish somebody had taught me because it would have saved me a lot of kind of heartache. So all of these things are really scary, and you might think, well, actually they're all really boring and I don't want to think about them, but they're all really important because they're all ways of advocating for yourself and keeping yourself safe and right. Because if you don't know how to do these things, you're already putting your registration at risk. And you can't go on to have all those lovely things and those wonderful births and those great relationships if your registration is in doubt. Okay. So now the warm fuzzy bit. So we also need skills to protect ourselves as individuals. And it kind of goes hand in hand with the scary, horrible clinical risk kind of bit because it's all wrapped up together. And on this slide are lots of terms that I didn't know the meaning of 8 years ago. And unfortunately, I know what they mean now because I have experienced all of them. Okay? And I think it's important to be able to identify the things that you're feeling and experiencing and the things that you may go on to feel and experience as you continue your career, because only when you can put names to them and give them language and sort of words can you then take action and manage them. And again, most of your career will be wonderful. And in addition to these things, you will experience joy, pride, exhilaration, contemplation, rapport, great relationships with the people in your care and the people you work with. But you might experience some of these things as well. So I'll just go through them quickly, but it helps to know the difference between stress and burnout. So stress isn't always a negative thing. We all undergo stress when our bodies and minds are working hard to do something. It just means you're being stressed, you're placing demands on your system. It's not necessarily definite. But you need to know when that stress clicks over into something that's more acute and almost terminal. So you can love your job to the nth degree and you can be the best midwife there is, but you may get to a point where you don't love your job anymore. You actually couldn't really care less what happens to that woman on the bed. You actually don't even want to be there anymore because you're sick of it. And it's really important to understand when that stress has clicked over into burnout and the steps you need to take to alleviate that. Because I wrote a piece about this a little while ago. I can't remember exactly what I said, but I said something like burnout isn't just one big blaze of glory. It's lots of little fires. So I think when we think about burnout, we imagine like, oh my God, I just got to this point in my career. It just all nosedived, couldn't do it anymore, ran away, never came back. Now that does happen to some people, but more than likely what might happen is that you just hit little walls at different points in your career where it's really good to take a step back and maybe refresh and rejuvenate yourself. So I think it's important to understand that difference and how to manage it. So the next thing on this list is vicarious trauma. So when you experience something vicariously, you're experiencing it, there's sort of the emotions of it through somebody else who's actually experiencing it. And over the last 18 months, we've all seen a lot of trauma. So we've seen maybe women separated from their partners at a time when they're really vulnerable or distressed. We've seen people get bad news, give bad news. And vicarious trauma is when you absorb that trauma yourself from having to watch somebody else go through it. And I feel like there's been a lot of that this year. Moral injury kind of ties into that. And I spoke at the start of the presentation about having to be an enforcer and having to enforce rules that on some level, why they're there and are important, but it just doesn't feel right. So when a woman is crying and distressed and she's begging for her partner and you're saying, well, no, he has to wait in the car park, it doesn't really feel right. And when you're doing that over and over and over again, just as an example, that maybe really doesn't feel right. And, it's not just something specific to COVID. Let's say you're having to examine a woman at a time when she's really vulnerable or distressed, and or maybe you're participating in an intervention or you're just around part of the atmosphere at a time when you can tell the person at the center of that is really being traumatized and affected. And that can be quite hurtful individually as well if you feel like somehow, well, I've been a part of that, and I know that doesn't align with my values as a midwife. So that's moral injury, and it's important to understand that as well. And finally, mental health first aid. So we all have to go through our sort of like immediate life support, workshops, and we have to know how to do chest compressions and pull the emergency buzzer and get the mask on, and that's all great and really important. But what if you or a colleague is having an episode of really acute mental distress at work? And that can just be like, oh, my friend the auxiliary is crying in the sluice. I mean, who has not cried in the sluice? Or I just can't face another patient today. I just cannot see the next person in the waiting area. Or I can't go back into that room after the sister spoke to me like that. Or, any of those things, and you've just hit a wall, like that's it, clocked out, game over. What do we do? I mean, you feel quite helpless when those things happen. Like, how can you take immediate helpful steps to help yourself or that other person who's in that position of distress? I mean, for a long time, I didn't really know. I would probably just cry and then go home, and if that's your first aid, that's fine. But what I know now is that there are actually immediate steps you can take to help somebody or help yourself in that acute situation. So we probably should know those things. And there are other ways to seek help if you need more ongoing support, whether that's through occupational health or your sort of UNI's pastoral care, or whether that's somebody outside your organization. So a lot of people who feel like they need support actually feel rightly or wrongly that they can't go down the route of seeking help through occupational health because rightly or wrongly they feel it's stigmatizing, or there will be, something on their record about needing mental support that they don't want there to be. But there are lots and lots of other organizations that are out there that are specifically designed to provide support for healthcare workers and people on the front line. So it's good to know about that as well. And I didn't learn any of this at uni, so I don't know if you are, but I definitely didn't. So why do I care? Again, when I wrote Hard Pushed, I didn't really think of myself as somebody who would get really involved with supporting student midwives or newly qualified midwives or even midwives in general, really. I mean, I wanted to sort of amplify the challenges of our profession and provide maybe a more realistic portrayal of what our role was. But what started to happen, and what I really didn't expect, was student midwives seemed to really like the book. Because, I mean, it came as quite a surprise to me, because I did not paint the rosiest picture of the job, and I kind of expected it would maybe put a lot of people off, but apparently it hasn't. And I actually feel a little bit guilty because I've had a lot of messages from people saying, oh, I read the book and really made me take that last step towards filling in my application, or I was thinking about it for years and this has really inspired me to take that step. And then I look around at the environment I work in and I kind of think, really? Sorry about that, guys, because that wasn't what I intended. But obviously I appreciate that and I respect that. And I feel like now, if I can do something to honor that enthusiasm and to give something back to you guys who have shown me so much support and appreciation, this is the time definitely to do that. So what am I actually doing? Well, I'm a little bit busy, but why not just do something else? So yeah, I am a midwife, practicing midwife. I work 1 or 2 shifts a week. I'm writing another book, but why not throw in something else? So what I've decided to start offering over the coming year is workshops for student midwives or newly qualified midwives to give you these skills that it sounds like you're not learning, but you need for today's workplace. So there's going to be a little bit about me, my journey to midwifery, how I became a midwife, and what things have been like over the last 8 years, writing my book, writing my next book. And then these other 2 big sort of chunks that we've talked about, these sort of practical skills to protect your registration and more sort of soft skills, emotional skills to protect yourself. And this is not, the point of this presentation is not to be a big plug for me, but if you're interested, you can find out more information on my website, which I'll cruise to just now. Funnily enough, named after me. So you can click on that, and there's a page called Workshops that will tell you a little bit more about the content and structure of the course. Or, of course, you can get in touch with me on Instagram or Twitter if you want to just say hi. So that is the general gist of what my thoughts are in terms of what you're not learning, what you should be learning, and how maybe we can rectify that situation. Thank you very much for bearing with me, and I'm more than happy to open to any questions if anybody has anything they'd like to add.